Are handheld light meters irrelevant in 2020? I can't give you a definitive answer. I can only give you a personal opinion. But before I do that, let's just take a look at this meter. I'll show you what it does and how to use it. And I'll also explain why I bought it. It measures light in two ways. It can measure incident light and reflected light. And the way that your camera measures light is by using reflected light. So you point the camera at the subject and it meters the amount of light that's being reflected from the subject. We do that on the light meter by having this white piece, which is called a lumisphere, in this position, and it just measures the reflected light. However, your camera actually does a much better job, because on modern cameras we have different metering modes. We have center weighted average mode, partial mode, evaluative mode, spot metering mode, and this just has the one general mode. A more accurate way is to put the lumisphere here and to place this just in front of the subject, so it's actually measuring the amount of light that falls on the subject. To use it, turn it on and first set the ISO value. So hold the button down and there's an up and down button on the side, and just click those buttons until you get the ISO you want. I'll leave it at 100 ISO. Next we need to set the light mode, and that can be done using this button, and it cycles through 4 modes. What we're seeing here is the ambient light mode for a selected shutter speed, then an ambient light mode with an EV value, a flash mode without a cord, and a flash mode with a cord. So let's go back to the ambient light mode with the shutter speed, and all you do is just use this button on the side to select the shutter speed you want. Once you've done that, you press the measure button, and that tells me that for an ISO of 100 and a shutter speed of 125th of a second, I need an aperture of 1.4. If I go into EV mode, it doesn't give me a fixed shutter speed and aperture, it just gives me an EV value. So what I'll do, I'll take another reading. This one's given me an EV of 7.8, and there's a chart which gives you different combinations of shutter speed and aperture for each EV value. So for example, if I had an EV of 9, I could use an aperture of f5.6 and a shutter speed of a 15th of a second, or an aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of an 1/8 of a second, or an aperture of f2 and a shutter speed of 125th of a second. If I'm using a flash setup, I've got 2 options. One option is using a sync cord, and the other is without a sync cord. If I'm using a sync cord, I need to select the option that has the little C next to the flash sign here. And I just connect my sync cord between this socket and this socket. And then when I press the measure button on the side, that simultaneously triggers the flashes and takes the light meter reading. If I haven't got a sync cord, I need to select the other option, the little flash symbol without a C. And then I press the measure button and it will start blinking, and it will blink for 90 seconds. And then when I trigger my flashes, that's the thing that will actually induce the light meter reading. It's all quite simple, and to be honest, if you're just measuring ambient light, the metering system in your camera will probably do a better job. And there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, when you use your camera, it will be using the lens that you'll actually be taking the shot with. And secondly, as I said before, modern cameras have got all these clever metering modes, which this little thing hasn't. The reason I bought it was because some years ago I bought a cheap studio light system. This is one of the strobes from that system, and it's not TTL. With TTL, the camera controls the flashes. So the flashes are triggered, and then the light that is reflected from the subject back through the lens is measured. And when the camera sees that there's enough light, it then turns off the flashes. There's a feedback loop. With these things, there's no such feedback loop. They just put out a fixed amount of light each time. So you need to set the camera controls so that you get the right exposure. And because of that, I thought it was necessary to use a light meter to first measure the light, and those readings from the light meter will then help me to set up the camera properly. After a while, I realised it wasn't really necessary, so I stopped using it and just started to use my LCD display and histogram to set the exposure controls on the camera. There are many differences between film and digital, but a fundamental difference is the instant feedback we have with digital. That didn't exist back in the film days. Back then, most photographers wouldn't know what their images were like until they came back from the lab. And if they'd shot an important session and the images were bad, that was a real disaster. The only option was to get a camera with a switchable film back. So you'd load some Polaroid film, take a few test shots, make sure your lighting was okay, and then put in your regular film stock. But it wasn't completely accurate. It was inconvenient if you were doing a wedding, taking shots inside the church, then outside. You couldn't expect everyone to hang around while you messed around changing film backs. And cameras with switchable film backs are also quite expensive. It was therefore necessary at the time of shooting to make sure that everything was correct as possible. And even though our cameras had internal metering systems, having an external light meter just gave us a bit more assurance everything was going to be okay. Nowadays, with digital cameras, we have instant feedback. We have LCD screens and histograms, and we can see immediately if the exposure is okay or not. And if it's not, we can just dial in a little bit of exposure compensation or flash exposure compensation. So we just don't need to be as fastidious as we used to be back in the film days. Modern camera systems still have throwbacks to the film days, and I'm reminded of this every time I see exposure bracketing or flash exposure bracketing. What's exposure bracketing? Well, the camera takes one shot at what it thinks is the correct exposure, and then shots either side to get a lighter and a darker exposure. And back in the film days, it was just another guarantee that one of those shots was going to be correct. But to be quite honest, in the era of digital photography, it's not really necessary. So back to my original question, are these things relevant in 2020? And my personal opinion is no. I hardly ever use it, and if I didn't have it, it really wouldn't be a problem. Other people may have different opinions, but that's just my personal opinion. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. There should be another video coming out fairly soon, and thanks for watching.